Ronda Rousey, in several podcasts to promote her book, Our Fight, she mentions several, in her words, somewhat abusive judo coaches. She mentions Big Jim and Little Jim. So Big Jim is in fact Jimmy Pedro Sr. and Little Jim is Jimmy Pedro Jr. Ronda's mom, Anne Marie DeMars, decorated judo athlete in her own right, decided that she should send Ronda to train with the Pedros back when Ronda was about 16. So that was a move for Ronda from the LA area out to Massachusetts. In retrospect, I think that is a really wise move for Ronda's mom to make, because even though she could have continued to coach her daughter, she knew that age right there, 16, 17, was kind of a critical transition year when a competitive athlete moves from fighting in the kids division, like Junior Olympics, to transitioning into fighting in the adult division, where the rules are a little different, and certainly the level of competition and the attitude and the seriousness is much greater. Now, to give a little context on who Big Jim and Little Jim are, if you follow Kayla Harrison in her MMA career, there's a little clip that gets used and reused where Kayla's getting out of a cage in the dojo, and she's kind of sobbing, and there's a white-haired gentleman who's saying something to her to the effect of, well, we want the training to be hard so that the fight will be easier. And Kayla's just sobbing and saying, yes, I know, I agree. Okay, well, that white-haired gentleman is Jim Pedro Sr., aka Big Jim. Now, he was an Olympic alternate back in 1976. Now, his son is, of course, Jim Pedro Jr. He is the gentleman who you see mat side for Kayla throughout all of her international competitions, and of course for her 2 Olympic gold medal wins. That was Jimmy Pedro Jr., the coach. Jimmy Pedro Jr. is also a highly decorated judoka. He won 2 Olympic bronze medals, and he was also world champion in judo. This is back in the 90s, early 2000s. So now here's the sort of interesting example of legacy in terms of generations of athletes. So we have Big Jim Sr., who's an Olympic alternate, meaning he almost made the Olympic team for the United States, but he didn't. So now he knows full well what it takes to actually make the Olympic team, and he fully prepares his son to make the Olympic team, which Jimmy does multiple times. And one of the key things Big Jim did for Little Jim was to send him abroad to train under the great Neil Adams in England. And as a side note, I think that's where Jimmy Pedro Jr. developed his very strong gripping game, as well as his Taitoshi. I think he gained a lot of knowledge from Neil Adams, MBE. So now we have that second generation of someone aspiring to the Olympic Games who makes it, and lo and behold, now we have Jimmy Pedro Jr., who knows that he's the best in the world, right? Because he is a world champion, and yet he comes away with not 1 but 2 Olympic bronze medals. So I'm not trying to denigrate that accomplishment. That's an amazing accomplishment for anybody to win an Olympic medal. But that tells me that Jimmy Jr. knows full well what it is to know that you're the best in the world and yet make one small error in the semifinals of an Olympic Games and then wind up with a bronze. Now, to win an Olympic bronze medal in judo, you do actually have to win at least one more match if you lose in the semifinals. They don't just give the bronze medal automatically to the people who lose in the semis. There's a system in judo called repechage, which means literally translated to fish again. And so if you lose in the semis, the other folks who lost to the two finalists have a chance to fight back. So if you lose in the semis, you have to fight the winner of those, the bracket of those folks who lost to one of the two finalists. So my point being, to win a bronze medal in judo, you actually have to win. And so, it's got to be a somewhat tough pill to swallow, but Jimmy Pedro Jr. knows whatever that is, that small gap between knowing you're the best in the world because you're a world champion and yet falling just that little bit shy of what it takes to capture Olympic gold. So my point here is, now here comes the next generation, Kayla Harrison, and I'm sure that whatever that is, that wisdom, that knowledge, or that little bit of mental preparation, I'm quite certain that Jimmy, passed that on to Kayla. So here we have 3 generations to get to the top, as we say. Now, I have met both Jim Sr. and Jimmy Jr. Long time ago, back at a tournament called the Quebec Open in Montreal, because Jimmy Sr. would bring Jimmy Jr. and Tanya, his daughter. He would bring them as teenagers up to a couple of the tournaments in Canada. I think simply to give them more exposure to athletes from Canada. At least there's a little bit of an international flavor there, and just he put his teenage kids in the adult division tournaments just to develop more experience. So that's the first time I sort of encountered them. And then later, as a competitor with the United States of America, I did run into Jimmy Jimmy Jr. more than a few times. So here's what Ronda had to say about both of them. She actually says that Jimmy Jr. dislocated her jaw at a training camp, and that at some point Jimmy Sr., I think, did something like grabbed her or put his hands around her neck or did something to say like, hey, a woman can never defend herself against a man. Ronda's explanation for putting up with these things was just that she was, I guess, naive and just didn't know any better, and that, to a certain extent, I guess she felt that that's just what she had to put up with in order to get good coaching. So I guess the question might be, well, is this true, or is this Ronda making excuses? And no, I don't think she's making excuses at all. I think these are true anecdotes that she's sharing. The motivation behind Jimmy Jr. and Jimmy Sr. is a little, I can't answer that. I don't know either of them well enough to address any sort of darker or inappropriate sides to their coaching methodologies. I've actually never been coached by either one of them. However, I will say this about Jimmy Jr., in that I am aware of another female judoka who went to a training camp at his dojo and suffered an injury during practice, and was effectively told, just suck it up, keep going. And then, so she did for at least a couple more days, and then upon return home, decided to go to the hospital, and lo and behold, the injury did require medical attention, and not just a bag of ice. I won't go into too much detail just because leave that athlete with her own privacy. But in other words, really, a responsible coach would have sent that athlete to get medical attention, Johnny on the spot. I mean, it's not a career-ending injury. It's obviously not a life-threatening injury, but yet and still, they can say, abuse can sometimes be neglect, right? So just not necessarily an act of kindness, at the very least, we could say. Now, Big Jim Sr., I've had like little to no, I've had no interaction with him directly, just observed him from afar. But Ronda does allude to the fact that he also put his hands on her mom and said effectively the same thing, like, oh gee, look, a woman simply can't defend herself against a man. So I'm not really sure what that's all about. If it's not in the context of a woman's self-defense lesson, then I don't see the point of bringing that point up as you're coaching athletes, because that's kind of not the point of females and males training together. In the United States of America, we just don't have enough bodies to have, women's only practice, men's only practice. We need all the bodies we can get on the mat that are good, well-conditioned athletes to help each other get better. But Big Jim does come from an era where women's judo or women doing judo didn't get a lot of respect, mainly because women's events were not included in the Olympics. Men's judo was introduced in the Tokyo Games in 1964. Women's events were not introduced until 1988 in Seoul, and it was introduced as an exhibition sport, so only the top 8 women in the world were invited to compete in all 7 weight divisions. So for Big Jim, since he was a competitor in the 70s, there was a lot of sort of poo-pooing of quote-unquote women's judo. I put it in quotation marks because really it's not a separate sport. It's just a different person doing the same sport who happens to be female. So partially because it wasn't an Olympic sport, women weren't eligible for funding, and therefore participation was lower. Women would have to self-fund to attend international competitions and whatnot. So as you can imagine, there's just not quite the breadth or depth as there could be today. And overall, yes, a lot of men were very denigrating of women participating in judo. So regardless, I mean, the thing is, for both Jimmy Jr. and Sr., their star pupil is Kayla Harrison, of course, and she happens to be female. So no doubt their dojo and they as coaches have gotten a lot of positive publicity from Kayla Harrison's success, not only winning 2 Olympic gold medals, but now, of course, stepping into the cage. So my only question is really, has there been any response from either Big Jim or Little Jim, or even perhaps Kayla Harrison, as to what Ronda has shared with everybody in her book? If you guys know, please let me know in the comments. If you have any other thoughts on this or questions, please include that in the comments. Thank you for listening.